When I was a kid, I played so much Pokemon to a point where if I saw something with Pokemon on it, I had to have it. I mean, I guess the same is true even today. Why did I buy this? I don't even know what it is. But I even played all the spin-off games too, and I always wondered what it would be like if there was a Pokemon game where you could play as a Pokemon. Enter Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team were released on September 18th, 2006 in North America, with Red Rescue Team being on the Game Boy Advance and Blue Rescue Team being on the Nintendo DS. They're basically the same game, except Blue version has the luxury of having the bottom screen to make the game feel a bit less cluttered overall, since some information can be displayed down there instead. Kinda weird how they were released the same day on two different consoles, one of which being the console's predecessor, but I guess if you didn't have a Nintendo DS, you could at least still play Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. I also never realized this until I started working on this video, but there are version-exclusive Pokemon in each Mystery Dungeon game as well. Red Rescue Team had an extra one in Porygon even, but Blue had Magikarp, therefore Blue version is superior. I was so excited when I first saw these games on TV and when I first read about them in Nintendo Power, which makes me feel old. So much so that on release date I had to get both versions when they came out, something I never did up until this point with any other Pokemon game. At this time I was still a kid and never bought both versions on release date, main series or not. I even still have the original box that my copy of Red Rescue Team came in. I don't know why I decided to keep this box out of all the GBA boxes. If only I kept my boxes for Ruby, Sapphire, Fire Red, and Leaf Green. But I still have this one, even though I can't find the actual cartridge for this game anymore. Lately, there's been some more hype surrounding the Mystery Dungeon series after the original Red Rescue Team game was put on Nintendo Switch Online, and that even trickled into Mystery Dungeon viewership on YouTube going up, which is partly why I decided to make this video on Mystery Dungeon now, and also because we're pretty close to the original release date. So what exactly is Mystery Dungeon anyway? Mystery Dungeon is a video game series in Japan that dates back to 1993 where you traverse through different dungeons collecting items and battling creatures. That's the simplest way to explain it, but once they slapped Pokemon on it, it exploded in popularity and saw international releases. Slapping a franchise as big as Pokemon onto a game can do wonders for that game. I mean, just look at Pokemon Pinball, Ruby, and Sapphire. This game sold 1.3 million copies for the Game Boy Advance, which is more than Sonic Advance 2 and more than Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which are pretty big standalone games on the Game Boy Advance, and this is literally just like, it's just pinball. Like, there's nothing special about it. It's literally just pinball, and it's one of the top selling GBA games of all time. Pinball. Unlike Pinball, however, the addition of Pokemon actually ties in pretty well for the Mystery Dungeon series. The general story for the game goes that one day you fell asleep and then just woke up on the beach as a Pokemon. The Pokemon you get turned into is dependent on a personality quiz you take at the start of the game, and you're discovered by your partner Pokemon, which you can pick among a cast of mostly starter Pokemon, then other popular Pokemon at the time like Meowth and Psyduck, but for some reason they decide to add Machop and Cubone as well. I usually get Mudkip or Cubo when I play through the originals, so interpret that however you like. The gameplay is similar to the regular Mystery Dungeon games, with you and your rescue team traveling through randomly generated dungeons to save Pokemon or thwart the evil team's plans. This time though, the Pokemon battling mechanics are introduced to the Mystery Dungeon series, which work pretty well for the most part. The obvious way battling mechanic works is super effective damage moves and resisted damage moves, but things are a bit different. Super effective moves only deal 1.4 times damage instead of the normal 2 times damage like it was in the main series games, and resisted hits deal only 0.7 times damage instead of 0.5 times damage. Then type immunities work differently as well, as you can go for a ground type move on a flying type Pokemon. This was probably so if you only had access to ground type attacking moves, you aren't stuck at any point of the game if you encounter a Pidgey. Critical hits only do 1.5 damage in this game instead of 2 times damage that they did in Generation 3 and 4 as well. Moves can be combined in Mystery Dungeons 2 or linked, so you can go for multiple attacks at the same time. You can link them at the town square by talking to Gulpin, and you guys know we love Gulpin representation. The only issue with linking moves is that if one of those moves runs out of PP, then those moves become unlinked. I still use link moves a lot when I play through Mystery Dungeon, and it's very powerful going for multiple moves at the same time. Status moves and status conditions work differently too. There are too many to list all the differences, but for confusion, instead of hitting yourself, your Pokemon will just move to a random tile instead, or attack in a random direction. I should probably also mention that the map works in a grid-like formation in the dungeons, with each step or attack being one turn. Speed plays a role in this too, but not in the traditional speed status we see in Pokemon. It's really travel speed which determines the amount of actions a Pokemon can do in a single turn. It's something you should be aware of, as fast Pokemon can sometimes attack you twice before you even get to hit them once. And the last important stat is hunger. This is a new thing in Mystery Dungeon, and in your inventory you have items that you can hold, which we'll discuss more later, but this includes various food items. The more actions you do, the hungrier your Pokemon will become, so it's important to stock up on food, especially later on in the game when you're going through longer dungeons. The main form of food is gummies, which have various colors and work best on different types of Pokemon. For example, Rock-type Pokemon prefer the Gray-type gummy, and Fire-type Pokemon prefer the Red-type gummy. Thankfully, you aren't just limited to finding your food in dungeons though, otherwise your Pokemon would die over and over again. You can buy some items at the Kecleon shops. Like Gulpin, these Kecleons are other Pokemon that appear in the Pokemon Square to help you along your journey. There are 2 Kecleon here, with one being pink, which isn't even what shiny Kecleon looks like, but they'll sell you a ton of random items. Sometimes you'll find what you need, and other times you won't find what you need here. My favorite item has to be the Stun Seed though, which you can throw to stun an enemy, and look what Stun Seed spells backwards. You are limited on the amount of items you can carry at once, but there is the Kangaskhan storage area you can deposit your excess items to use later on. This is especially useful since if you die, you lose some of your items and your money. There's a more traditional bank here as well, ran by Persian, where you can deposit your coins just in case though, as if you die, you lose all of them. Those are what I would say are the most important areas in the Pokemon Square, but there are some other neat ones like the Makuhita Dojo you can train in, Wigglytuff where you can buy new friend areas for your new Pokemon you befriend, which kind of acts like different PC boxes in a way. And then the post office, of course, to the east, which has various other quests and side missions for you to complete. This is where you would also go to do some online missions, which were a thing back then, and never forget what they took from us. There's plenty of optional missions you can do here to either train up your team, stock up on items, or just go through dungeons if you really want to, which adds a ton of replayability to the Mystery Dungeon series. There are a few other key NPCs you'll find in the game too, like Whiscash of the Whiscash Pond. Here is where you can evolve your Pokemon, but only after completing the main story. We'll discuss more about that later on, but since the Pokemon stats work a bit differently here than in the main series games, and because your HP stat can be much higher than normal, only having, say, a Squirtle against the final boss of the game really isn't as bad as it might seem. As for other NPCs who don't have shops, there are Alakazam, Charizard, and Tyranitar of Team ACT. They're the strongest rescue team around and are often tasked with the most difficult missions and act more like mentors to the player. Alakazam is their leader and has the most dialogue, often speaking for the team. There's a couple of other strongest teams around too though, like Team Shiftry and Team Hydra that you'll run into in the story, but Team Act are the main ones. The evil team is also very appropriately named Team Meanies because, as you can guess, they are pretty mean. You first encounter them very early on in the game and they persist throughout the main story to annoy you, with Gengar being the main member of this team. Then there's Gardevoir. Throughout the game you'll have a few dreams involving Gardevoir. And no, get your mind out of the gutter, it's not those type of dreams. Now, minor spoilers are ahead, but the dreams get stronger as they go on, and eventually you're told that the reason why you became a Pokemon was to fulfill a certain purpose, and once you fulfill that purpose, you can be turned back into a human again. The story behind why Gardevoir is even in the game is because Gardevoir once belonged to a greedy trainer who entered a dungeon with a special Ninetales. The trainer tried to touch one of Ninetales' tails, but the Ninetales was upset by this and tried to place a curse on the trainer instead. Gardevoir then jumped in front of the trainer to take on the curse. Ninetales would have undone the curse on the Gardevoir after seeing how much she cared for her trainer, but the greedy trainer ran away instead, leaving Gardevoir behind, abandoning it. The Ninetales told Gardevoir that one day that trainer will be turned into a Pokemon, and this would also bring on natural disasters. There's also Xatu, who has psychic powers and can see into the future. During the game, the player goes to him for guidance to learn more about why they were turned into a Pokemon, and Xatu is the one who tells the player about the story with Ninetales and the greedy trainer. Gengar overhears this conversation and then tries to convince the other Pokemon around that the player was the greedy trainer all along, and that you're the one responsible for all the recent natural disasters, forcing you to run away with your partner Pokemon after everyone decides to turn on you. At this point of the game, it's also unclear if you really are that greedy trainer or not. It sure looks like you possibly could be, but the only way to know for sure if you track down Ninetales yourself and ask it. I don't want to spoil more in case you haven't played the original games yet, as this is a very pivotal point of the story. I highly recommend you play Mystery Dungeon if you haven't though, starting with the originals. It has one of the most emotional stories out of any Pokemon game, which can be said about every entry in the Mystery Dungeon series. I'd say the story in Explorers of Time and Darkness, or Explorers of Sky, which is basically the Emerald version of Time and Darkness so to say, has the deepest story, but seriously, be prepared to cry when you learn more about this different Pokemon Pokemon world, why you're turned into a Pokemon, and the impact the player has on the world and the other characters around you. Now, in terms of talking more about the gameplay itself, it can get a little bit repetitive. Now, that isn't always a bad thing, as I literally sit here for hours resetting my game over and over again just for a shiny Torchic, replaying the same 25 seconds or so. And look at that, still nothing. Yeah, I bet you were probably wondering how I'd incorporate my current shiny hunts into this video, and there you go. I can see some people being bothered by the repetitive nature of the Mystery Dungeon games, as you have to go through so many dungeons, but the farther into the game you go, the more Pokemon you'll encounter, and you'll find different challenges in the dungeons like water or weather to at least change it up a bit. It's definitely not for everyone, but I don't think it's that bad. Next, since you started a new rescue team, and most rescue teams have at least 3 members active at a time, even though the limit is 4 active members at a time, you're gonna have to recruit some more Pokemon to join your team. There are a couple of Pokemon you'll encounter in the story who will join your team no matter what, like Magnemite, but when I first played these games as a kid, I remember going through a ton of dungeons over and over again trying to befriend more Pokemon to join my rescue team, but I had such a difficult time. They made it easier in later entries of the series, but for the original games, it's super annoying. I found this article on GameFAQs and a link in the description to be referencing, which explains recruitment in more detail. First, a wild Pokemon has a chance to ask to join your rescue team if you defeat one while your leader Pokemon is in an adjacent tile to them, and your leader Pokemon must also give the final blow. You can have a max of 4 Pokemon out on your team at once. Most Pokemon have a body size value of 1, but some have theirs set to 2 or even 4. This is important because your team's overall body size can't exceed 6, which complicates team composition a little bit more. Next, recruitment must be enabled in the dungeon that you're in. There's a chart in this article explaining more about this, but as far as I can tell, there isn't a way to tell in-game if recruitment is open or not. For the earlier dungeons, recruitment is disabled on the first visit. However, you'll be visiting these dungeons a lot for side quests anyway, so it's not too bad. After that, every Pokemon has a recruitment rate percentage assigned to them. If that percentage is negative, then you can't recruit them, which is the case for a lot of evolved Pokemon. You'll have an easier time recruiting Pokemon like Weedle at 11.4%, but even at that, it's pretty difficult still, as you still have to make sure your leader is the one to knock it out and be right next to it. The whole recruitment process in this game is very tedious and difficult for no real reason. It was unusual to play a game where you can't catch a ton of Pokemon, especially coming off of the main series games where that was the whole point of the professor even giving you a Pokedex in the first place, and even from other spin-off games like Pokemon Ranger, where you have to constantly catch Pokemon for various tasks throughout the game. Maybe we can make a video on Pokemon Ranger in the future, but let's face it, Mystery Dungeon is the far superior spin-off and it's way more popular. The recruitment mechanics are my biggest gripe with this game because of how annoying they are, but they do offer one of the most difficult experiences in any Pokemon game when it comes to recruiting a Kecleon. Of all Pokemon, who would have thought that Kecleon would be the hardest to recruit? To even have a chance at recruiting one, you need to have the Friendbow item and a Pokemon at least level 90 for just a 0.1% of befriending Kecleon. Kecleon happens to be really strong though and is only encountered in shops you can find randomly in dungeons. If you try to steal from one of the Kecleon shops, even it'll attack you, and unless you're nearly level 100 or so, it'll probably just one-shot you. By the time you pass level 90, you'd probably think your Pokemon should evolve by now, however, evolution is only allowed in the post-game. I never really fully understood why this was the case even, and I remember being so confused as a kid when I would bring my Pokemon to the Whiscache to evolve and be unable to evolve, despite being a higher level than the Pokemon need to evolve at in the main series games. Now, while the story does end with the final boss fight and the credits roll, there's still so much more to do in the original Mystery Dungeon games in the post-game. The game really opens up to do whatever you want without a set story, although there are a couple of missions out there that do tie into the story a little bit. I remember a while ago, I made a video beating the original Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, how Nintendo intended it. Check that video out, by the way, link in the description as well, where we followed the official strategy guide as closely as possible, which was about as big as the guide was for the main series games. The weird thing about it though is that the walkthrough starts on page 24 and ends on page 39, spanning only about 15 pages, while the post-game section goes from page 40 to 78, totaling for 38 pages, being more than twice the size as the portion on the main story. This just shows you how much there is to do in the post-game when it comes to exploring new dungeons or revisiting old ones. You can recruit many legendary Pokemon too and learn more about the world and the Pokemon in it. This makes the world feel much more lived in, although I do find it a bit weird how these games are from the main game story. Like, if the Ninetales from the story about the greedy trainer exists in the same world as the main story does, then where are the rest of the people? Does this take place in the same world as the core series Pokemon games like Pokemon Ranger does? I'm probably just overanalyzing this game too much, a lot like I'm doing this whole video even, and kind of like what I do with my whole channel. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon came out in the 3rd generation era of Pokemon, which was my favorite era since I was a kid then, and there were so many cool Pokemon spin-off games and weird things like this. They tried a ton of new things with Pokemon during this era, and when it comes to the Mystery Dungeon series, there was even a manga series and some anime specials on TV. I remember watching the TV specials and loving them so much. I even have the manga, and I remember reading this over and over again. The TV special was how I first heard about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, and the idea of being able to play as a Pokemon made me fall in love from the series from the very beginning. It also gave us this cool Gulpin portrait, and this is like the most representation Gulpin has ever had in any Pokemon medium ever, so thank you Mystery Dungeon for actually representing my favorite Pokemon. Even today, with no new brand new entry released in nearly a decade for the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, the fan base behind this series remains very strong today. I heard the remakes of the originals released on the Switch in 2020 were pretty good, but I haven't got around to playing them yet. If you really want to experience the original Mystery Dungeon series again, or for the first time, that's a good place to start, or you can just play the actual originals now that Red Rescue Team is on Nintendo Switch Online if you have that. I just hope that this isn't the only Pokemon game released for the GBA that's also available on Nintendo Switch, because surely they'll release more of them, right? Maybe in the future we'll get a brand new Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game for the Switch or whatever, but who knows, they kind of forgot about a lot of the fan favorite spin-off games from the Generation 3 and Generation 4 era. But hey, if they can make a brand new Pokemon Trozy game 10 years after the original, I guess anything's possible. So that's Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team, and a bit about the Mystery Dungeon series as a whole. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, and with all that out of the way, thank you so much for watching, have a great rest of your day, I'll see y'all next time, and bye bye!